Yeah, and then
So
you open up the hood and you've got everything under there. But there's a lot that goes on. I mean, it's funny that you say that. Although I was having conversations today about conformance and file operability and all this. It's not that easy, but I'm glad we have a lot of people that understand it better than me.
So you do talk about it in sort of a basic way. I mean, those things are the things they are, but when you sort of look inside a little bit deeper, they're somewhat different as well.
Yeah,
But I mean,
correct.
go ahead. I mean,
No, I was going to say, but ultimately, there was this. In my previous job, I always said to people, well, why can't we get this out without this? And they said, no, we need a full package. And I was like, yeah, but send this first. And then that one will go. I'm like, full package, Michelle. They're like, foot on the ground, full package. Everything needs to be complete. It's the same thing. It really is. And I feel like, we're just getting to a place where it might go faster, it might go quicker, it might go, to another location beforehand. But complete files, complete packages, it's pretty much the same. It either goes up on a feed in one way or the files goes over the other way. I mean, Steve, because you're part of that package.
It's funny, yeah. I'm going to definitely agree with the fact that you look at something that is complex. None of what we're talking about is complex. And there's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of automation. There's a lot of software involved. But at its core, you're just doing the same thing over and over again. So to be able to look at that process, simplify that process down, and then enable customers, studios, platforms, whoever, it doesn't really matter because they're all getting the same thing, to sort of have an opportunity to identify those similarities where they might be siloed in multiple different directions depending on what their original business model is, and identify that those business models are starting to come together, which is what we're going to talk about today. It is surprising how many similarities are there, and where my piece of this is, and the piece that I look at is we're leading with some of the transactional space, right? Like transactional avails are a very small piece of the puzzle. However, they are a pretty massive trigger to sort of help push everything along. It sort of kicks off quite a bit of what this process looks like. We're seeing titles and we're seeing metadata maybe 3 months out, maybe even earlier. And we can talk about COVID too, but to be able to have that stance and grasp on the data up front, and to be able to kick that off, it's crucially important. But then it also begs, well, are you prepared with your sort of lifespan of a title or lifespan of a piece of data? What does that look like? Because I feel like you can prepare.
So you mentioned avails and rights and so forth. Some of our audience is coming from the digital world where they would get an avail or perhaps a title list. Some people are coming from you get that information in Cable Labs VOD metadata, and all the dates and so forth are in there. For someone who's maybe in one camp or the other, is it really that different? I mean, can they, is there a sort of conceptual differences between the two that if they want to cross that bridge that they need to think about? That was Steve.
Okay, good. No problem. It's funny. I over the last month, I was doing an exercise where I looked at, probably 8 to 10 different styles of templates. And I did a cross-reference, like what is the same on all of these templates? What does that look like?
Yeah.
And how does it compare? My software really drives home, and we try to drive home the whole idea of EMA standardization. We believe in it. We think it's great. And I was like, well, these guys whoever it is, aren't using that. Well, what is the major difference? And you know what? There's not a whole lot. So when we talk about avails per se, you have some title level metadata in there. You mostly have, your avail, of course, avail level metadata. But at the same time, there's an opportunity because those specs are out there, because they've already been generated, to kind of do all that together. Whereas I know some of those partners, some of those outliers are looking at metadata as, well, this title level stuff comes down the road, like we just said, but there's an opportunity right there, among others, to unify sort of that process. And then you're getting it sort of at the same time, you're preparing ahead of time. You're being proactive instead of reactive, where you have, different levels of the chain getting different information at the same time. And then, on top of all that, it's sort of up to the studios, because we do see differentiation between something we got 3 months ago and something that comes in, right? Titles change, IDs update.
Windows.
Exactly. Windows
are in some cases the most complicated. I mean, I started in digital distribution where it was like we had a start date, we had an end date, and now you're bringing in all these new platforms that might have a start date, but the end date is kind of in perpetuity, or it's a 2040 date or something.
Yeah. Well, and in these studios, I mean, I get it too. The studios I work with on a day-to-day basis, they have basically said, we don't want to put an end date on any of this because we want to keep ourselves open-ended. But I think that's great. I think the start date and really focusing on that and really having a plan of how you're going to distribute that content, ending is not necessarily the problem. But you're absolutely right. Having that window flexibility is the new norm. Everyone is doing it. It's happening today.
Yeah.
But start dates can change too. I mean, they're not exactly fixed, right? You have a show that was going to air, and there's a big news event, it gets bumped, and suddenly your start date gets moved too.
Yeah, you're totally right. And you know what? I think what we were talking about yesterday is there's no way where no one is ever going to be able to plan for these massive news updates, or something that's going on globally, which pushes content, and it sort of is causing people to rework their channel, rework their distribution schedule. But I think being as proactive as possible, you move one thing instead of 5 things. That's a super hypothetical, so sorry, but it's definitely allows you to have that flexibility, whereas just making changes on the fly because you want to, I think that's the bigger problem than reacting to something that's happening in the world.
You're saying that the kind of getting to the assets and making changes quickly and not having it be a 5-day turnaround versus just delivering information into a feed.
Of course, yeah, that, and you look at some platforms, some are not automated and some are. So when you have an automated platform, sometimes all of that's ready, weeks in advance. And then the metadata is what's triggering that being live on a certain platform or not. Obviously it's easier if it's a manual up or down. I work with MVPDs that definitely have that curation process, and they make those choices on their own. But yeah, I think once again, just that proactivity up front is crucial.
Right.
All right. So Steve, how do you create? I mean, so let's just say we have the avails information in a cable as VOD document, and you have it in a EMA avails document. People, you've got on top of that, you've got 1,000 proprietary spreadsheets and emails and cocktail napkins and whatever else might be. Yeah. So how do you create an industry-wide solution? I mean, how do you? Should we? It's like
it's a huge question, right? And I think there's opportunity out there. I think there's people who are like myself, right? Like my kind of sole job is to take a look at, well, what does everything look like in what's happening today, right? So I think I would use the word normalization. I think I would use the word automation, and I think I would use the word adaptivity, if that's a word. Whereas we talked a little bit yesterday about how the studios were driving a lot of this. You said it in your introduction, right? But now everything is moving so quickly and everything's changing and everything is keeping up with the Joneses that you almost need help, right? Who's doing what and who's doing what when. I do think there's an opportunity for those two worlds to marry, at least on the metadata and avails front, where you have avail level and title metadata. Yeah. I think there's no reason why they can't. And you know what? Maybe it's not in a spec, but maybe it's in a system, where you can leverage whatever you want, right? And you can make those decisions as a content provider rather than being siloed. There's so many options out there now, obviously with SaaS solutions, but not just us. It's just the nature of the game. Get help. And I know there's people out there who can do it.
Yeah. So I don't want to express bias here, but I'm biased and can't help it. There's to me, the online streaming OTT digital streaming, home entertainment, whatever you want to call it, world, more closely matches the, for lack of a better term, VHS model than it does the linear broadcast model. And what I think I found looking at different use cases and different organizations that have done things is they kind of run out of steam with the broadcast standards when trying to do OTT. And because it's nothing's right or wrong. It's just that maybe one's ahead of the other in terms of adding those features that are necessary. Plus, I don't think the specs for broadcast have been updated in like 5 years. So
no,
5 years. We're not talking. We're talking at least dog years here in terms of what 5 years means. So, I thought what we'd go through is go through like some of the different areas and talk about how the two compare and how one would like think about which standards to adopt or approaches to adopt or how to deal with them. So, let's start with metadata because that's always a fun one.
Yeah.
So you have a couple of, many different metadata standards. As Andrew Tannenbaum said, the wonderful thing about standards is you have so many to choose from. But so how would you approach metadata from these two worlds? If you were an OTT platform, what would you sort of drive towards?
Well, I'm gonna jump in on that one just because we actually have this process that was really interesting when I got to the company, and it was like this, a way that we could kind of serve up content to potential customers, let's say, and I basically said, so how are we doing this? And everyone's like, well, there's, everyone has their own sheet. What do you mean their own sheet? Yeah, you've got to go in. And I was like, well, show me what these sheets look like. And it was literally like a library of all these sheets of all like how metadata needed to be inputted into this thing. One needed to be saved to PDF, one needed to go to a regular spreadsheet, one needed to be updated to, and I was like, this is a full-time job. And we're not even guaranteed that this is going to be, that these titles are going to go. Like, we've got to find a better way to do this. So we're not there. I wish we were. I wish we were. I mean, it seems so simple. The first metadata report I ever filled out was for iTunes, like 10 years ago or something, and it was just like an Excel spreadsheet with a certain number of characters that could fit in each quadrant. But the truth be told is, the retailers, while they try to somewhat conform, they still want to remain unique. So that's where this whole like the uniqueness factor to who they are kind of messes with what we're trying to do. That's what I see. I understand it. You want to remain, kind of, out there and differentiate yourself. And in some cases, I feel like people use metadata to do that. I don't know, Steve, what do you feel?
No, I feel like there's also a clout factor there too. You have some platforms that are like, great, we'll take everything. We know what we want, and we're going to have an automated backend. And then you have other platforms or OTT or otherwise, really, that either they care, but opinion sometimes gets in the way of that, right? Yeah. So, I think in this case, to answer your question, Craig, from my perspective is, imagine a world where you have the idea of a round trip, right? So maybe it's not a problem that you solve, but it's maybe a problem that you put a little bit of firepower behind. Whereas, what I always do whenever we're solving a problem, whatever it is with my team, is like, well, what's the source of truth? Where does that come from? What does that look like? And if you plan accordingly and you have that source of truth and you've generated that and your entity, studio or otherwise, agrees on that, then and only then can you build from it, right? And when you do that, the doors start to open like crazy. One thing that I've been working on is, well, okay, we know about data rights. We know about catalog metadata. It's so basic. It's so easy. And then catalog rights definitely get more complicated. But, well, why don't we leverage that to go build something that allows people to have a way more automated approach? And that's kind of the third thing too, is sure, you have that source of truth. Sure, you're starting to be able to leverage that data in multiple different directions, whereas before you have worksheets and all those different workflows. And believe me, we were in that same boat as well as well as the studios, as well as some of the retailers. And it's eye-opening how kind of crazy that was. But then when you start to, and I use this word because it's not a word, but softwaretize things, you start to really open your eyes of what's possible. Because at the end of the day, when you have something that's machine readable and you already know what all that data is and what it will do, then you really have an opportunity to sort of, once again, open those doors for yourself too. And that goes for everybody. That goes from the studios to OTT platforms to MVPDs. Like the MVPDs that I work with right now, the mandate is we want our data simple. We don't really care how it gets here. We just want it simple because we want to make our selections and we want to go down the line and we want to, create our jobs and, whatever they do. Whereas if you take it one step beyond that and you have your data driving those informed decisions, wow.
Yeah.
It's a new ball game for sure.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about, the worst thing that comes to my head is, and then you layer AI on top of that.
Stop revealing my secrets, Michelle.
There you go. Layer AI on top of that, and then everything becomes, is up for grabs.
Yeah.
Well, I remember it wasn't that long ago. I was talking to the head of engineering at a, shall we say, very large streaming video platform. And they told me that they didn't want to have a standard or any kind of good way of delivering metadata because they were so good at dealing with the chaos. They felt that was their competitive advantage. By the way, they've adopted the standards now. I mean, and I would posit, and maybe I'm sure I'll get myself in trouble for this, but I would posit anyone who thinks that they're competing based on their metadata format has a serious misunderstanding of the core value of their business.
I would actually,
except for service providers who are the ones to do that.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're a platform and it's like, I'm going to win because I have a proprietary metadata format or whatever, it's like you won't, and it's not going to help you.
Well, you're absolutely right, because data is data, and you might have it appear a little bit different, but I don't know. I dealt with so much metadata across so many different properties. And then when I was on the studio side, we realized that we had 7 different descriptions for one film. Completely different too.
Yeah.
That was really fascinating. That was like, wow, this is positioned this way and this is positioned this way, and it's which one's right.
Right, and they actually might all be right.
They're all right.
I'm going to go into I'm going to digress here, but in common metadata, there's the ability to target localized metadata.
Yep.
It's actually a relatively new feature, but you can say this is the version when you're selling it. This is the version when it's in someone's library.
Right.
You can also say this is the version before it's in theaters. This is the version for pre-sale, and you can actually target your metadata and trailers and artwork for
the audience,
for specific things.
Yeah.
Good luck to anyone who's going to try to retrofit that into their spreadsheet, metadata system. I mean, it's just
at that point,
not in the cards.
Yeah. At that point, you're just creating frustration. And if you're frustrated, things will slow down.
Yeah.
And, the goal of the like I said, as a service provider, I don't really care. I just want things to go fast, right? And things go fast and things are standardized. That's a non-equation at that point. It doesn't matter. You're not going to make more or less money, right? So you're going to just enable yourself to be part with everybody else and then let your content speak for itself.
Right.
Get the art of the way.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna challenge that for 1 second, because you think about it at a time like now, where everyone's looking for movies about pandemics. There could be something within the metadata of an older film that might be the driver to, especially since everything's tagged today.
Sure.
So if you go back to every pandemic film, and it might not have been called a pandemic back then, but you want to include pandemic now because they're all going to come up, that actually does have some relevancy. I mean, there there is that component. The tagging piece of it is really interesting, and that all metadata is based off of that. I would go back and make sure that everything is characterized in a, kind of more appropriate way than it was back then.
So I have a question here from Nona Jansen-Walls. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. The format is one thing, but if the metadata is rich, it better informs the selection and recommendation engines which the audience love. Wouldn't that be a competitive advantage? And
that's kind of what we're saying. That exactly. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, words are powerful, and listen, I think everyone does a really good job of kind of, cultivating a great audience experience. But the truth is, it lays down deep below, and that's where things get, and that's what people are looking for today, especially.
Yeah, and some of these platforms, are curating. The curated platforms are curating hundreds, if not thousands, of titles. So the more you can stick out, the better. Of course. Yeah. So metadata richness is something that we've actually seen from both directions, right? Yeah. So when you're building a catalog too, or you're acquiring titles, customers I've talked with, they're, how do we make our metadata even richer than it already is? And there's certainly options there as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, no, completely, Nona, that's exactly what you should be doing.
All right, so let's. I hesitate to bring this up because I'm opening Pandora's box, but a lot of linear broadcast is kind of single country, single territory based. Yeah. What about the transitions to sort of to internationalization? And we actually have another panel on internationalization, I think, tomorrow. But in terms of the sort of linear broadcast world versus the VHS world, how is internationalization viewed differently?
You're talking mostly about localization, correct? I mean,
I'm sorry. Yeah, the specifications would be internationalized. The content would be localized, but multiple languages. Both in the content and the metadata, ratings. Yep. Just the territory specific constraints, things like that.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I can imagine from a rights standpoint what you guys go through on that. For us, from a delivery standpoint, it's a necessary evil. It's Pandora's box you're opening up. But the truth is that Netflix kind of started this. They were the ones who started bringing content over. They started localizing it. I think it was easier to go from the native language to English. That was easier. But if we want to see the world of content expand, explode, it has to be done. It just does. We live in a global world, just sitting in front of a computer today and having access to everything. I want to have access to the same things that people across the world have access to, and I'm sure they want to see what's happening here. The magnitude of data, though, and I'm going to hand this over to Steve, is it's tremendous. I mean, it is almost like one feature or one episode can have upwards of what? I don't know. I mean, if we think about how many countries Apple is in.
I was going to say, look at any major Disney movie and how many countries there are, because they're going to release in just about all. Yeah, exactly. It's a very steep slope and a very steep mountain. And when you look at it from a title level standpoint, I'll kind of go back to what I was saying at the beginning. I think, and this is one person's opinion, of course, too. There's lots and lots of people who weigh in, especially on that panel on Thursday. But I will say that it's when you are producing content and when you own content and or at least have an idea of what the lifespan of that content is, in your opinion, or what you'd like it to be, based on foreseen partnerships or partnerships that you have today, it's all about planning. And yes, that means money. Of course it does, because you're going to have to get your subs. You're going to have to get your dubs. You're going to have to get, especially in some territories where, you have to be overly cautious about media. You're going to have to get titles approved. You're going to have to get metadata approved. You're going to have all that. But on the other hand, is if you do that work up front, and it kind of exactly to your point, Michelle, it's like, well, the more international you go, the more money you can potentially make because we have a national pandemic, nothing's being produced right now,
Right.
and international pandemic, I should say. And on top of that, why do you think Will Smith movies do way better internationally than they do in America now? Because people are hungry for that content, right? So, I think it is simple. I think it is planning. But once again, you are opening Pandora's box. But if you're willing to do that, I think it pays off. There was something I've been working on also recently too. Is like, okay, well, one problem that we came across was, well, how do you automate? What would it even look like to automate that? Like, what if you had a house where all of your titles and metadata lived, and you just said, great, outlet number 1, territory number 2, and then whatever else you wanted to do, and then it goes into the different rooms and just picks all that stuff, and then you get, to Nona's point actually, then you get that rich metadata, you already have it localized, and then you can kind of start to do it. But, I from my perspective, that's, written data, whereas the deliverables is much, much, much more than that, because you need all of those audio tracks. You need all those edit variations, which definitely happens internationally. We've seen that before. But, I welcome it because I think it's a smart idea. I think globalization of media, just as, once again, my opinion, is inevitable. This is only released in the United States versus the rest of the world. I think is going to change very quickly. We're already starting to see it with some pretty major European broadcasters. Yeah, maybe you change the name of it to fit an American audience, but it is inevitable for everybody to share, and then who knows what will happen when everyone starts buying everybody else too. So.
Well, I mean, it was interesting, as not spoken about, but you saw the evolution of it. Netflix started in the US, and then they started kind of rolling out slowly, and then more territories. Amazon still today is in, a limited number of territories, the Prime service. But then you had Apple that launches all their originals everywhere.
Yeah.
And it was like this, unbelievable, upload of that. Probably easier if your content is original and you're working on it from the get-go.
Of course.
Going back and doing the dubs and subs on things that were from the 80s and 90s, it's tough. It's not, and might not even be suited for the audience today, which is really interesting.
Is that something that you think? Is that obviously you want to do your whole back catalog, but is that something you think that people would want to do as like a go forward, or are you seeing it more as, well, we got to do the whole thing if we're going to be available everywhere?
That's expensive.
So some of it depends on territory as well. There's always, we're actually going to talk about this in the internationalization panel, but a lot of it is a function of just return on investment.
Yeah, it's
and if you don't go into Italy, for example, unless you're going to have Italian dub, in Japan, there's as long as it's not oriented towards children, there's a tendency to watch it in the original language, the OV, and watch with subtitles. So a lot of titles you can get away with without a Japanese dub, but not animation.
And then there's the genre too.
It's a question of understanding the territory.
There's the genre. It's like animation is 4-quadrant, sell it everywhere, cradle to grave. You love it if you're 6, you love it if you're 60. You can do that. Those are always the ones that do the best. But it really comes down to the actual the films themselves.
That's the strategy, though, right? You know what it is. Let your content do the work for you. If you see value, if you know that there's value there, invest and go. That's what I would say.
So, a lot of what we're talking about here is expanding markets, right? Not just using better standard. And actually, that's really what we're all talking about. We're talking about of all of this is expanding markets, right? How to reduce the time it takes to process things so you can process more things. You can have more titles on your site. You can distribute more your titles to more partners. Whatever side of the equation you're on, it's always better to do it efficiently.
Yeah.
I
agree with you. I hope that whoever you're working with agrees with you that what you're doing is bringing efficiency, which is, sometimes easier said than done. But anyway.
Right. All right. Let's come back to rights management and avails. We did talk. I mean, we maybe drive down a little bit deeper. You have EMA avails.
Yeah.
You have, again, it's just a US spec, but Cable Labs VOD. But I'll use it as a sort of template. There's also DPPS stuff and other stuff around the world. I'm sure EBU has something. One of the things that I noticed that is a byproduct of this linear broadcast world is that there was no need to separate the rights from the licensing or whatever from the metadata because it's all one package.
Mm-hmm.
In the OTT and streaming world, we tend to separate them. Can you talk a little bit about maybe difference in cadence in terms of the delivery of metadata and rights in the OTT world versus the linear broadcast versus the sort of traditional, DVD world, I suppose?
Sure. Yeah, I think, it's a loaded question, man. I think I know we've talked, I know, like the point. Nah, but I think, like when we look at avails today, I work very heavily in EMA avails. It does the job because it's been thought through. It's been through many iterations, and you have specific digital retail partners and lots of studios, especially major studios, which do drive a lot of the revenue in the industry, making those decisions and deciding on how this would work, right? I think that's step one, right? Standardization is the most important thing just because it at least gives you the base language, right? And once you start to speak the same language, then you can expand because, we have the Google Plays and we have the Amazons and there's Microsoft, Sony, there's all kinds of these major video platforms that do take EMA. And right now there's a disconnect, and it could be more than this, so I apologize if I miss on this one. But right now, we have the sales transaction, right? We have EMA avails have, the license type. It has pricing data if you want it, or tier data, whatever you wish. It has very limited metadata because it's secondary, right? You don't really need it to do the transaction. You need to know what it is. You need to know what the IDs are. You need to know what the dates of availability are, and then what it's going to cost. And that's fantastic. That's great. That does the job. And then you give your lab or post house the amount of time they need to fulfill those purchases or deals or whatever you want to say. Job. We call them jobs, but either way. So I think that I think the disconnect is because you don't need them to be connected. But one of the problems that we see a lot, not necessarily in the sort of like the googly Amazon space, but more in like the MVPD space, is the disconnect of, well, maybe there's a secondary template, right, that is asking for different or more metadata, which is fine. But if there's a disconnect anywhere along those lines, or if that process is manual and your avail process is automated, anytime there's a disconnect, it shuts down the system. Anytime an ID doesn't tie everything together, it shuts down the system. So I think for me, being able to help people centralize data and centralize how they want to use their data, that's the core. It's not necessarily making things separate or some different submission times. It's the core of how that data is surfaced. Once again, I apologize if I went off on a little bit there, but I have to look at these problems more holistically. I have to take big steps back because I understand why it's happening. But okay, so and your question, do we even need to change it? That was from earlier, but
yeah,
it's not going to be. I think if it were up to me and I could walk into a room and say, hey, by the way, everybody in this digital sphere, in this retail sphere that we're talking about, I don't really care. MVPDs, doesn't matter. Imagine a world where you had one-stop shop where you could pull all of your metadata from, or click a button and generate whatever you want to do, right? But that source of truth doesn't change. That's that's where I would go. So if I was a studio today, right, and I said, well, man, I'm submitting all of these different templates for all of these different retailers, and like one of my studio customers today, I saw their list of retail partners. There's more than that, but it was like 80. It was like 80.
Yeah.
It said, how many of these partners do you generate something different for?
Yeah.
They said almost all of them. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead, Michelle.
No, it's interesting. I'm going into my own personal hard drive here, thinking about, those things do exist. I think it's more of a trust factor. The content owners don't necessarily trust what has been put in there. If they provide it in a certain way, and then all I can think of in my head is like a unified lookup. Almost like a version of the lookup in Excel where you've got, various components across the board. You need this, and this, and it matches to something that's a variation of EMA or Cable Labs, and boom. I want to say poof, there you go. Somewhat in the sense of like, if there was ever this, quote, the content cloud with all the content sitting there, there'd be the metadata cloud as well, because you'd need to match it.
Right.
And then a unified. This can be done. I mean,
Yeah.
we're. I don't want to say putting men on the moon, but the things that we're doing today, and the things that like the medical community is doing today. We should be able to figure this out. You know what the stopgap is people. People are, we talked about this yesterday. It's the comfort zone. I do it this way. I'm going to keep doing it this way. But this can be done. This is a small project, just to centralize specific guys almost. It usually, there's just a lot of people standing in the way.
So we're out of time. So that's a great place to end. There's a long way we can go forward, and to your words, it can be done.
Yeah.
It just takes will for people to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to the day when we're there.
And service providers to help.
I was going to just add that point. They can't say it so much because they're, but I can.
I think the three of us should have virtual drinks one night and
there we go.
Yeah.
I just want to add that they're not allowed to do advertising during these panels, but I can say that service providers play a key role in this because they're kind of the universal adapters. And if you don't actually want to deal with all these problems, you're going to want to talk to a service provider somewhere along the way. So I just want to do a quick ad for the next session. It's going to start in about 7 or 8 minutes. We'll give people a little time to go, a momentary break or whatever. But it's a good session. We're going to talk about crawl, walk, run, which is really about how you start slowly and work your way into all of this, and talk a little bit about what that is, and also talk in terms of ITER. So we can talk about the MDDF standards and ITER and have a discussion on that. So I think it's going to be a good session. New material, never before seen. So hopefully we'll see you there. Cool. And thank you, Steve. Thank you, Michelle. This is great.
Bye, guys.
I'll stop the recording, Craig. Okay.
Very good. See you over there.